Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The first known mention of the Hollow Creek church bell appears in county records from Marion County, Arkansas, dated April 1903. What began as a simple dedication ceremony for a new church bell would spiral into one of the most disturbing episodes in Ozark history, a tale that officials would later attempt to bury beneath bureaucratic paperwork and collective silence. The church stood in a narrow valley near the Buffalo River, approximately 8 miles from the small settlement of Yellville. The white clapboard structure with its modest steeple had served the isolated community since 1879, but it wasn't until the spring of 1903 that the congregation, led by Reverend Thomas Blackwood, acquired their bell. According to parish records preserved in the Arkansas Historical Archives, the bell was purchased from a foundry in St. Louis that had gone bankrupt the previous winter. What makes this case particularly unsettling is how thoroughly it was documented before being systematically erased from official records. Between March and November of 1903, 17 adults associated with the Hollow Creek Church would be committed to the Arkansas State Lunatic Asylum in Little Rock. By December, the church would stand abandoned, its doors chained shut by county officials. The bell itself would disappear entirely. In the summer of 1963, historian Margaret Holloway discovered a collection of sealed documents in the basement of the Marion County Courthouse while researching Ozark religious practices. The materials, including medical reports, witness testimonies, and personal correspondence, were promptly confiscated by county officials. Holloway's subsequent research notes were reported missing following her unexplained withdrawal from academic life later that year. What follows is based on fragments of those documents that survived, pieced together through cross-referenced accounts, and the few official records that escaped purging. The narrative that emerges suggests something far more disturbing than mass hysteria or ergot poisoning, the two explanations officials would later propose. It points to a deliberate silence surrounding events that defied rational explanation, events that began with the arrival of a seemingly ordinary church bell. The Hollow Creek settlement sat nestled in what locals called the Shadow Valley, where the winter sun disappeared by mid-afternoon behind the steep ridges. The families who populated this isolated community were primarily subsistence farmers, supplemented by hunting and gathering from the surrounding wilderness. Church records list 43 adult congregants in 1903, though children were not formally counted. According to tax assessments from 1902, the community consisted of 26 households spread across roughly 4 square miles of difficult terrain. The church served as both spiritual center and social hub, the only gathering place besides the general store operated by Samuel Keene, who would become the first to document the strange occurrences. The settlement had been established in the 1870s by veterans of the Civil War seeking isolation from the rapid changes sweeping the country. The first residents constructed their homes from local timber, building along the creek that gave the settlement its name. According to county records, the area had previously been used by indigenous tribes, primarily Cherokee, who had been forcibly removed during the 1830s. Local lore suggested they had avoided settling in the valley itself, preferring the ridges above despite the harsher conditions. The isolation of Hollow Creek was extreme, even by Ozark standards. The nearest road passable by wagon ended 2 miles from the settlement, requiring all goods to be carried in by mule or on foot, along a narrow trail that followed the creek. During winter months, the community could be cut off entirely for weeks at a time. This isolation bred a particular kind of interdependence among the residents. According to diaries and letters preserved from the period, the community maintained traditions of mutual aid that had disappeared in more accessible regions. Barn raisings, communal harvests, and shared child-rearing responsibilities created a tight social fabric that made the subsequent dissolution all the more shocking. The bell arrived by wagon on March 17, 1903, transported from Yellville by 4 church deacons. Reverend Blackwood's personal diary, partially preserved in the Marion County Historical Society's microfilm collection, describes the bell as handsome though unremarkable and of standard dimension and tone. The only unusual detail he noted was its unusually dark patina, which he attributed to age. Parish records indicate that the bell was purchased for the sum of $18.75, a considerable expense for the modest congregation. The funds had been collected over 2 years through special offerings. Blackwood's diary mentions that the bell came without provenance, the foundry's records having been lost in a fire shortly before its bankruptcy. The installation of the bell became a community event. Men from throughout the settlement gathered to raise it into the modest bell tower that had stood empty since the church's construction. According to an account written by Deacon Ellis Pruitt, the work took most of a day, with the bell finally secured by late afternoon on March 20th. Pruitt's letter to his brother notes an odd occurrence during the installation. As we hoisted the bell into place, all fell silent for a moment. The rope slipped, and the bell gave a single toll that seemed to hang in the air longer than natural. Thomas Blackwood remarked that the valley's acoustics were even better than he'd hoped. The first official ringing came during Sunday services on March 22, 1903. Reverend Blackwood himself pulled the rope, calling the congregation to worship with a series of measured tolls. In his sermon notes for that day, he spoke of the bell as a voice for our community, carrying our prayers skyward and calling us together in fellowship. What might seem like insignificant details take on greater meaning in light of what followed. Within days of the first official ringing, the first disturbances began. From the Journal of Samuel Keene, dated March 26, 1903. Martha complained again about the bell, says it rings at odd hours, though I hear nothing. She woke 3 times last night, insisting it was ringing. I went outside each time, but heard only the wind in the pines. She seems agitated in a way I've not seen before. Similar accounts began to emerge throughout the community. By early April, Reverend Blackwood had received complaints from at least 7 households about inappropriate bell ringing. According to church minutes, he assured the congregation that the bell was only rung for Sunday services, Wednesday prayer meetings, funerals, and emergencies, all under his direct supervision or that of Deacon Ellis Pruitt. The timing of these initial reports is significant. They began not immediately after the bell's installation, but following 3 days of heavy rain that swelled Hollow Creek beyond its banks, temporarily cutting off the settlement from the outside world. Local weather records from Yellville note that this was the heaviest early spring rainfall recorded in over a decade. What makes this account particularly disturbing is the division that quickly formed in the community. Some residents, initially a minority, reported hearing the bell at unusual hours, midnight, pre-dawn, or at seemingly random intervals during the day. Others heard nothing beyond the scheduled rings. This discrepancy would eventually split the congregation into what locals came to call the hearers and the deaf. From a letter written by Ellis Pruitt to his brother in Springfield, dated April 12, 1903, Thomas insists we continue using the bell, despite the complaints. I confess I don't understand the objections. It has a fine, clear tone, though I admit it lingers somewhat longer than seems natural. The sound carries remarkably well through the valley. The first documented case of unusual behavior connected to the bell involved Martha Keene, the shopkeeper's wife. According to medical records later filed with the county clerk, Martha began experiencing insomnia in late March, claiming the bell's toll prevented her from sleeping. By mid-April, she had taken to stopping her ears with wax and cotton. Neighbors reported seeing her walking through the settlement at odd hours, apparently searching for the source of a sound only she could hear. Martha's behavior prior to the bell's arrival had given no indication of mental instability. County records describe her as a respected member of the community, serving as midwife to many families in the settlement. She had lived in Hollow Creek since its founding, having moved there with her husband from Tennessee in 1873. At 52, she was among the elder members of the congregation and known for her practical nature. On April 18th, Samuel found his wife standing in the churchyard at 3:17 a.m., according to his statement to local authorities. She was barefoot despite the spring chill, staring up at the bell tower. When he approached, she reportedly told him, "It's speaking, not ringing." Speaking. When he attempted to lead her home, Martha reportedly became agitated, insisting she needed to answer its questions. Samuel's account describes how he was forced to physically restrain his wife, who demonstrated unusual strength in her attempts to return to the bell tower. By morning, she had fallen into what he described as a state of catatonic terror, refusing to speak or acknowledge those around her. Martha Keene would become the first resident of Hollow Creek to be transported to Little Rock for treatment. Medical records describe her condition as acute melancholia with auditory hallucinations. She would never return to the settlement. The journey to Little Rock was arduous, requiring Samuel to transport his wife by wagon over rough mountain roads for nearly 2 days before reaching the railroad at Harrison. According to his account, preserved in a letter to Reverend Blackwood, Martha remained silent throughout the journey, except for occasional periods when she would press her hands to her ears and whisper, "It's following us, still ringing." The community's response to Martha's breakdown reflects the broader pattern that would emerge over subsequent months. Those who didn't hear the unscheduled rings dismissed the hearers as victims of overwrought imagination or moral failing. Reverend Blackwood, who never reported hearing unauthorized tolls, initially counseled prayer and forbearance. From his sermon notes dated April 26, 1903, "The Lord tests us through tribulation. Let us not succumb to superstition or idle fancy. The bell calls us to worship, nothing more." Those who hear otherwise might examine their own hearts for the source of such disturbance. This spiritual interpretation would shift dramatically as more congregants began reporting unusual experiences. By early May, approximately 1/3 of the adult church members claimed to hear the bell at unscheduled times. The descriptions of these unsanctioned tolls grew increasingly consistent, a slightly flatter tone than the normal ring, with prolonged resonance that some described as throbbing or pulsing. More disturbing were reports that the unscheduled tolling seemed to follow patterns unique to each hearer. Eliza Thornton, wife of mill worker James Thornton, reported that the bell rang precisely 33 minutes after she completed any household task. Jacob Miller, a farmer from the eastern edge of the settlement, claimed it tolled whenever he considered abandoning his failing crops. Sarah Williams, the schoolteacher, heard it only when reading certain passages from Scripture. From Sarah Williams's diary, recovered from her abandoned home in June 1903, somehow it knows which verses trouble me most. Today it rang as I read Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones. Yesterday, Revelation 9, it rings, and I understand words in the ringing that are not in the text, but should be. Further entries in Williams's diary detail her increasing preoccupation with the bell's messages. By early May, she had begun transcribing what she described as translations of the ringing, fragmentary phrases that she believed contained hidden meaning. These transcriptions grew increasingly erratic, eventually devolving into strings of numbers and crude sketches of concentric circles. The school where Williams taught closed in mid-May after parents complained that she had abandoned the curriculum in favor of having students listen in silence for extended periods. According to statements from older students, Williams would frequently interrupt lessons to press her ear against the classroom wall, claiming she could hear the bell more clearly through the wood. By late May, the situation had deteriorated significantly. Church attendance dropped as hearers found the regular bell ringing increasingly intolerable. According to multiple accounts, they would cover their ears or flee the service when the bell was rung. Meanwhile, several deaf congregants, including Reverend Blackwood, began ringing the bell more frequently, apparently hoping to drown out whatever phantom tolling plagued their neighbors. This conflict over the bell's use became a physical manifestation of the deepening divide. Church records show that Blackwood authorized additional ringings for special prayer services that increased from weekly to daily by the end of May. Each authorized ringing triggered protests from the hearers, who claimed it intensified their experiences of unscheduled tolling. The community's cohesion continued to fracture along increasingly rigid lines. Hearers began to avoid the deaf, claiming they couldn't trust those who denied the unscheduled tolling. The deaf, in turn, grew suspicious of the hearers, interpreting their behavior as signs of moral corruption or mental instability. From a letter written by Reverend Blackwood to the Baptist Association headquarters in Little Rock, dated May 30, 1903, I fear something has taken hold of my congregation that prayer alone cannot remedy. Those afflicted with these auditory disturbances grow pale and thin. They start at nothing, sleep hardly at all, and speak of the bell as though it were a living thing with intentions. Most troubling is how their accounts align, despite having no apparent communication with one another. The physical deterioration of the hearers became increasingly apparent. Medical reports compiled by Drs. Howard Jenkins, who visited from Yellville on June 2nd, described symptoms including extreme weight loss, dermatological issues, and in several cases, unexplained bruising around the ears. Jenkins's preliminary diagnosis suggested nervous exhaustion compounded by self-imposed sleep deprivation. His report also noted an unusual behavioral pattern among the hearers. When in proximity to one another, they appeared to coordinate their movements without verbal communication, turning their heads in unison toward sounds others cannot perceive. When questioned individually about this behavior, each denies awareness of the other's movements. The first documented case of violence occurred on June 7, 1903. According to sheriff's reports filed in Yellville, Deacon Ellis Pruitt attacked fellow Deacon Silas Morley during Sunday services when the latter attempted to ring the bell. Witnesses described Ellis as possessed of unnatural strength as he wrestled Morley to the ground, shouting, "It's had enough! It's already full!" The altercation shocked the congregation. Ellis Pruitt had been known as a mild-mannered man, described in community records as temperate in all things. He had served as deacon for over 15 years without incident and was widely respected for his fairness in resolving community disputes. When restrained, Pruitt reportedly had no memory of the altercation. He was held overnight in the Yellville jail before being released to his family. 3 days later, he would be found hanging from a pine tree near the church, an apparent suicide. The coroner's report noted that his ears were packed with mud and pine needles. A letter found in Pruitt's pocket, addressed to his brother but never sent, contains perhaps the most coherent description of what the hearers experienced. It's not the ringing that's unbearable. It's what comes through in the ringing, a voice without words, a meaning without language. It asks questions I cannot answer, then answers questions I cannot ask. I know now why some can hear and others cannot. The deaf are fortunate. The bell hasn't chosen them. The suicide marked a turning point in official involvement. County authorities, initially dismissive of what they viewed as religious hysteria, began investigating the increasingly frequent reports of erratic behavior centered around Hollow Creek Church. From the field notes of Deputy Sheriff William Hayes, dated June 12, 1903, interviewed 14 residents regarding the Pruitt suicide. Accounts are inconsistent and often contradictory. Most troubling is the bell itself. I heard it only when pulled by the preacher, a clear tone without remarkable qualities. Yet, standing in the churchyard, I observed 7 different individuals react to what they claimed was the bell ringing when it was plainly silent. Their reactions occurred at different times, suggesting they hear it according to some individual schedule invisible to others. Hayes's investigation extended to the physical bell itself. His notes describe it as a standard bronze bell of approximately 200 pounds, with no maker's mark or inscription. He noted the unusual dark patina and took rubbings of what he described as minor imperfections in the casting, possibly the marks later identified as symbols by subsequent investigators. The deputy's report concluded with a recommendation that medical authorities be consulted regarding possible contamination of the settlement's water supply or food stores. This theory gained traction briefly among county officials, who authorized a survey of local wells and storage facilities in late June. No contamination was discovered, but the survey revealed another disturbing pattern. Households with hearers were distributed in a roughly circular pattern around the church, while those with exclusively deaf members tended to be either very close to the church or at the settlement's outer edges. Throughout June and July, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Church services were suspended after a series of disruptions culminated in a physical altercation between hearers and deaf congregants on July 5th. By mid-July, 8 more residents had been transported to Little Rock for treatment, all exhibiting similar symptoms: insomnia, paranoia, and an obsessive fixation on the church bell. Medical records from the Arkansas State Lunatic Asylum describe these patients as suffering from shared delusional psychosis with auditory components. Treatment notes indicate that distance from Hollow Creek did not alleviate their symptoms. Several patients reported that the bell's tolling actually grew louder and more distinct after their removal from the settlement. From treatment notes regarding James Thornton, dated July 26, 1903, patient continues to respond to stimuli others cannot perceive. When asked to describe the bell's sound, he became agitated and stated, "It's not the sound that matters, it's what comes after the sound stops, the voice in the silence between rings." When pressed, patient covered his ears and began humming tunelessly. The asylum's chief physician, Dr. Lionel Marsh, took particular interest in the Hollow Creek patients. His private research notes, discovered among Holloway's materials, document his attempts to understand the phenomenon through various experimental approaches. He observed that the patients appeared to react to the unheard tolling simultaneously, despite being housed in separate wards, suggesting either remarkable coordination or a genuine shared stimulus. Marsh's most disturbing experiment involved having 4 patients independently draw what they saw when they heard the bell. The resulting sketches, included in his notes, show striking similarities: concentric circles surrounding a central darkness, with lines radiating outward like sound waves. None of the patients had artistic training, yet the precision of their drawings was remarkable. As summer progressed, the community of Hollow Creek essentially ceased to function. Farm work was abandoned by many hearers, who claimed the bell rang more insistently when they attempted to tend their fields. The general store closed after Samuel Keene departed for Little Rock to be near his institutionalized wife. School had been suspended since Sarah Williams's commitment in early June. The physical degradation of the settlement mirrored its social collapse. Buildings fell into disrepair as basic maintenance was neglected. Crops withered in untended fields. Livestock either escaped or were sold off by residents preparing to leave. Visitors from neighboring communities described Hollow Creek as like a place already abandoned, with residents moving through daily tasks like sleepwalkers. Perhaps most telling was the transformation of Reverend Blackwood, who had remained steadfastly among the deaf throughout the early months of the crisis. His sermon notes from late July show a marked shift in tone. The division in our congregation reflects a deeper spiritual truth. Some are chosen to hear, others to remain deaf. I no longer believe this represents corruption in the hearers. Rather, they have been selected as witnesses. By August, Blackwood had begun conducting services exclusively for the deaf, while hearers reportedly gathered in the woods outside the settlement. Several accounts suggest that by this point, approximately half the adult population claimed to hear the unauthorized tolling. Blackwood's theological interpretation of the crisis evolved dramatically during this period. His writings show increasing preoccupation with biblical accounts of divine communication, burning bushes, still small voices, the trumpet heralding judgment. In marginalia found in his personal Bible, he repeatedly underlined Revelation 3:22. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The most revealing document from this period is a letter Blackwood wrote but apparently never sent to his former seminary professor. In it, he describes his growing conviction that the bell represented not a malign influence, but a divine test. What if God speaks not to all, but to some? What if faith requires not universal revelation, but selective transmission? The hearers suffer because they resist what they receive. I begin to wonder if I should envy rather than pity them. The situation reached a breaking point on August 17, 1903. According to statements collected by county authorities at approximately 9:30 p.m., multiple residents observed Reverend Blackwood entering the church alone. Shortly thereafter, the bell began to ring, a sustained tolling that continued without interruption for nearly 3 hours. From the statement of Frederick Danner, one of the few deaf residents who provided testimony, the ringing was different that night, slower, heavier. You could feel it in your teeth and bones. I watched from my porch about a quarter mile from the church. No lights were visible inside, just the steady tolling. Around midnight, it suddenly stopped. The silence after was worse somehow. When Blackwood failed to return home by morning, several men from the settlement entered the church. They found no sign of the reverend. The bell rope hung unmoving, though witnesses claimed the bell itself seemed to be vibrating slightly, producing what one described as a sound too low to hear but impossible not to feel. The disappearance of Reverend Blackwood prompted the most thorough official investigation to date. Sheriff's deputies from Yellville, accompanied by volunteers from neighboring communities, conducted an extensive search of the church and surrounding area. No trace of Blackwood was ever found. What they did discover, according to sealed reports later accessed by historian Margaret Holloway, were unusual markings carved into the bell itself, markings not noted in any previous examination. These were described as non-alphabetic symbols resembling musical notation that spiraled around the interior of the bell. More disturbing were the contents of Blackwood's home. Investigators discovered hundreds of pages of writing, apparently produced in the days immediately preceding his disappearance. The handwriting, confirmed as Blackwood's by his sister, grew increasingly erratic and finally illegible. Among the legible portions were repeated references to the congregation inside the bell and voices trapped in bronze. Sheriff's reports indicate that the papers were confiscated as evidence, but they never appeared in official case files. According to notes found in Holloway's research materials, these documents were transferred directly to state authorities in Little Rock and subsequently classified. The investigation also revealed that Blackwood had been conducting extensive correspondence with the St. Louis foundry that had produced the bell. Postal records confirm multiple letters sent and received in the weeks before his disappearance. The contents of this correspondence were never recovered. By September 1903, county authorities had effectively quarantined Hollow Creek. No one was permitted to enter or leave without official approval. This measure came too late to prevent what official records would later call the dissolution of the settlement. Between August 20th and September 15th, 9 more residents were committed to the asylum in Little Rock. Others simply abandoned their homes, leaving possessions behind in their haste to escape. By October, fewer than 20 adults remained in the settlement, most of them among the deaf. Those who stayed reported increasing isolation. Supply deliveries from Yellville became irregular as drivers refused the route. Mail arrived sporadically, if at all. The few remaining hearers were described as hollow-eyed and distant, spending hours staring at the church steeple, regardless of weather. According to statements from those who eventually left, the hearers had developed their own rituals in response to the bell. They would place stones in specific patterns around their homes, arrangements that seemed to correspond to the times they individually experienced the unscheduled tolling. Some began marking their skin with symbols similar to those later found inside the bell. The final incident, the one that would lead to the permanent closure of the church, occurred on October 30, 1903. According to statements from the few remaining witnesses, the bell began ringing at sunset, despite no one being seen entering the church. The tolling continued through the night. The pattern of ringing reportedly followed a distinct rhythm. 3 short tolls, 3 long, 3 short again, repeated for hours without variation. This pattern, known in telegraph communication as the SOS distress signal, had only recently been adopted for maritime emergencies in 1898. At dawn, the 7 remaining hearers were observed walking in procession to the church. They entered together as the bell continued to ring. None emerged. When authorities arrived from Yellville the following day, the church was empty. The bell had been removed from its tower. From the official report filed by Sheriff James Hardin, dated November 2, 1903. No sign of struggle or violence within the church. Bell missing from tower, mounting bracket intact. No indications of how such a heavy object could have been removed without disturbing the surrounding structure. 7 residents unaccounted for. Remaining inhabitants unable or unwilling to provide coherent testimony. The search for the missing residents extended throughout the surrounding hills. Tracking dogs brought from Harrison followed trails that ended abruptly at the creek's edge. Divers examined the deeper pools, finding nothing. The most extensive cave systems in the area were explored by experienced spelunkers, again without result. The only potential evidence came from a hunter who reported finding a series of footprints leading into a box canyon approximately 3 miles from the settlement. The prints reportedly stopped in the center of the canyon floor with no indication of where the walkers had gone. By the time authorities investigated, rain had washed away any traces. The official investigation concluded in December 1903 with no definitive findings. The church was officially deconsecrated, its doors chained and locked by county order. The few remaining residents of Hollow Creek dispersed over the subsequent months, most relocating to Yellville or more distant communities. In the absence of conclusive evidence, authorities attributed the events to mass hysteria, possibly triggered by ergot contamination of the local rye crop. This explanation appears in the few official documents not sealed or destroyed in subsequent years. No mention was made of the missing bell or the disappeared residents in public records. Perhaps most telling is what happened to those who had been involved in the investigation. Sheriff Hardin resigned his position in January 1904, reportedly moving to Colorado for health reasons. Deputy Hayes requested transfer to a different county. The physician who had examined the hearers, Dr. Jenkins, abandoned his medical practice entirely, becoming a traveling salesman. The case might have remained entirely buried if not for Margaret Holloway's discovery 60 years later. Her research notes, fragmented and incomplete as they are, suggest a more complex and disturbing reality than official accounts acknowledged. From Holloway's research journal, recovered from her abandoned office at the University of Arkansas in 1964, the common element across all testimony is the individualized nature of the unscheduled tolling. Each hearer experienced the bell according to personal patterns and preoccupations. This suggests not mass hysteria, but something targeted, almost tailored. Most disturbing are the consistent references to what followed the tolling, what came through after the ringing stopped. Holloway's investigation led her to track down surviving relatives of Hollow Creek residents. Most refused to discuss the settlement or denied any knowledge of their family's connection to it. Those who did speak offered only fragmented recollections passed down through generations, references to the calling bell or those who answered. One interview conducted with the granddaughter of Frederick Danner, one of the last to leave Hollow Creek, yielded a family story never included in official accounts. According to Danner's granddaughter, her grandfather claimed that in the weeks before the final incident, the hearers had begun to change physically. Their ears, he said, grew longer and more pointed, like they were stretching toward something. This detail was dismissed by Holloway as folkloric embellishment, though she noted its consistency with medical reports describing unusual cartilage development in several Hollow Creek patients. Holloway's investigation ended abruptly in September 1963, shortly after she attempted to locate the foundry in St. Louis that had produced the bell. University records indicate she took an indefinite leave of absence for health reasons. She never returned to academic work and died in apparent seclusion in 1967. A colleague who visited Holloway shortly before her withdrawal from academia described her as profoundly altered, jumpy, paranoid, constantly cocking her head as though listening for something just beyond hearing. This same colleague reported that Holloway's apartment walls were covered with reproductions of the symbols found inside the bell, arranged in patterns she claimed represented frequencies or wavelengths. The physical traces of Hollow Creek have largely vanished. The church structure collapsed sometime in the 1930s, according to Forestry Service surveys. The surrounding settlement was gradually reclaimed by the Ozark wilderness. Today, only stone foundations and the occasional rusted implement mark where a community once stood. What remains are the questions deliberately left unanswered by those who investigated the case. What caused the division between hearers and deaf? What happened to those who disappeared? And perhaps most importantly, what became of the bell itself? Local folklore in Marion County includes scattered references to a calling bell, sometimes heard in remote valleys during certain phases of the moon. Hunters occasionally report a distant tolling that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. These accounts are dismissed as echoes or imagination, the same explanation offered to the hearers of Hollow Creek a century ago. In 1952, a geological survey team working in the Buffalo River watershed reported an unusual acoustic phenomenon in several caves near the former settlement site. According to their field notes, certain chambers produced resonant frequencies that seemed to fluctuate independent of air movement or external sound. The lead geologist described the effect as like a bell ringing underwater, felt rather than heard. The caves were later flooded by dam construction in the 1960s, preventing further investigation. Perhaps most unsettling is a detail found in Holloway's final research notes, apparently recorded after examining metallurgical records from the St. Louis foundry. The bell, according to these records, was not cast from new bronze, but melted down from older sources, specifically smaller bells contributed by churches throughout the region, many of which had closed due to dwindling congregations. The Foundry Ledger lists 27 source bells, Holloway wrote, 27 congregations dissolved, condensed, and recast into a single voice. The implications are too disturbing to ignore. The ledger included limited information about these source bells, their weights, approximate ages, and former locations. Holloway's notes indicate she attempted to research each origin church, discovering that most had closed following unusual circumstances, congregation disputes, unexplained illnesses among church leaders, or structural failures in bell towers. One entry in particular captured her attention, a small bronze bell from a chapel near Springfield, Missouri, described in the ledger as the Harmon Bequest. Holloway's research revealed that this chapel had been abandoned in 1887 after its pastor, Ezekiel Harmon, claimed to hear voices in the bell's ringing. Harmon was subsequently committed to an asylum, where he died 3 months later. In 1966, 3 years after Holloway abandoned her research, a survey team from the Arkansas Archaeological Survey discovered a small cave in the hills above the former Hollow Creek settlement. Inside, according to their field notes, they found evidence of recent human habitation and carved into the cave wall the same unusual symbols reported on the interior of the missing bell. The survey was discontinued due to unsafe conditions, and the cave's location was omitted from published reports. A handwritten note in the margin of the team leader's field journal poses a question never officially addressed. Who maintains the candles we found burning? The nearest habitation is miles away. According to an interview conducted by Holloway with a former asylum orderly, the patients from Hollow Creek exhibited one additional peculiarity never included in official medical records. Each would become agitated at precisely the same time each day, 3:17 p.m., regardless of their location within the facility or their awareness of the time. During these episodes, they would turn their heads in unison toward the west, where Hollow Creek lay, beyond the horizon. This synchronization continued even after the patients were separated into different buildings on the asylum grounds. It persisted, according to staff records, until November 1, 1903, the day after the final disappearances at Hollow Creek Church. After that date, the patients reportedly became calm, almost catatonic, responding to neither treatment nor stimuli. Perhaps the most reasonable explanation is that nothing supernatural occurred at Hollow Creek, that a community isolated by geography and hardship simply fractured under psychological strain, transforming internal tensions into external phenomena. The bell in this interpretation was merely a focus for pre-existing divisions. Yet this explanation fails to account for the consistency of experiences among those who never communicated their symptoms to one another. It fails to explain the disappearances never resolved. Most importantly, it fails to explain why officials worked so diligently to bury all record of what occurred. An alternative theory, proposed briefly in Holloway's notes before her withdrawal from academia, suggests that the bell itself may have possessed unusual acoustic properties that affected certain individuals with particular auditory sensitivity. She referenced research into infrasound, vibrations below the range of human hearing that can nonetheless produce physiological and psychological effects in those exposed to them. The valley's geography, she wrote, could have created a resonance chamber that amplified specific frequencies produced by the bell, frequencies that affected only certain nervous systems. This would explain the division between hearers and deaf without requiring supernatural causation. Yet this theory, too, fails to account for the more disturbing aspects of the case. The coordinated behavior of the hearers, the symbols found inside the bell, the disappearances, and the bell's own removal. It offers no explanation for why the tolling followed patterns unique to each hearer, or why the experience persisted even after patients were removed from the valley. In the historical archives of the Arkansas State Lunatic Asylum, one final document offers a glimpse into the institutional response to the Hollow Creek patients. A memorandum from the medical director to his staff, dated December 1903, states, "The patients from Marion County are to be housed separately from the general population. Their condition appears to be communicable through extended conversation. Under no circumstances are they to discuss the bell or its ringing. Such discussions inevitably lead to deterioration in their condition and potentially in staff who document such accounts." The memo concludes with an instruction that perhaps best encapsulates the official position on the events at Hollow Creek. What cannot be understood should not be remembered. The records of the Hollow Creek patients end abruptly in 1907. No death certificates were filed, no transfers documented. They simply ceased to appear in asylum registries, as though erased not just from the institution, but from history itself. Today, the hills where Hollow Creek once stood remain largely undeveloped. Hikers on the Buffalo River Trail occasionally pass near the former settlement site, though no markers indicate its location or history. Local residents, when asked about Hollow Creek, typically claim no knowledge of the name or its significance. In 1968, the last known survivor of the Hollow Creek congregation died in the Arkansas State Hospital, the institution that had replaced the former asylum. According to nursing notes, his final words concerned the bell. "It's still ringing. All this time, still ringing. But now I understand the words." What words he meant, what message might have been encoded in the toll of an ordinary church bell, remains perhaps the most disturbing question of all. Some mysteries persist not because answers cannot be found, but because they cannot be faced. A particularly troubling aspect of the case emerges from a series of interviews conducted in 1959 by a folklore researcher from the University of Arkansas. The researcher, whose work was never published, spoke with elderly residents throughout Marion County about local legends and superstitions. Several interviewees independently mentioned a peculiar prohibition: never stand beneath a ringing bell in the Ozarks, especially at dawn or dusk. When pressed for the origin of this belief, none could provide a specific source. It was simply something everyone knew. One elderly woman from Yellville, however, offered an explanation passed down from her grandmother. The sound opens a door. What comes through depends on who's listening. The researcher noted that this prohibition appeared strongest in communities closest to the former Hollow Creek settlement, though none of his subjects explicitly mentioned the church or its bell. The superstition appeared to have been absorbed into regional folklore without retaining its historical context, a warning whose meaning had been deliberately obscured. Archival research conducted by Holloway revealed another disturbing pattern. Between 1904 and 1920, at least 6 other small churches throughout the Ozarks removed their bells without explanation. In each case, the decision followed reports of irregular ringing or congregational disputes about when the bell had been tolled. None of these incidents reached the severity of Hollow Creek, but the parallel is difficult to dismiss. Church records from the Arkansas Baptist Association show that in January 1904, a special committee was formed to address matters of sound and worship. This committee issued guidelines recommending that rural churches install bells only when proper supervision can be maintained, and suggested that bell ringing be limited to daylight hours when the congregation gathers as one body. These recommendations were circulated throughout the Ozarks, but never published in the association's annual reports or broader religious publications. Perhaps most significant is the response of religious authorities to the Hollow Creek incident. They exist only in internal correspondence, discovered by Holloway in the association's archive room, correspondence that was subsequently removed when the association learned of her research. The rugged valleys of the Ozarks hold many secrets in their limestone folds. Some are geological, some historical, some deliberately buried by those who came before. In the case of Hollow Creek and its inexplicable bell, the silence that followed may be the most telling evidence of all. In 1959, construction workers clearing land for a highway expansion near Harrison, Arkansas, approximately 40 miles from the former Hollow Creek site, reported an unusual discovery. While excavating a hillside, they uncovered what appeared to be a bronze bell fragment embedded in solid limestone, a geological impossibility given the metal's composition and the stone's age. According to worker testimony, the fragment bore markings similar to musical notation. Before geologists could examine the find, it was removed by unidentified officials who arrived within hours of the discovery. No record of the fragment appears in official documentation of the highway project, and workers who inquired about it were reportedly told that no such object had been found. This incident, mentioned briefly in Holloway's research notes, suggests a continued official interest in suppressing evidence related to the Hollow Creek bell decades after the original events. It raises the possibility that whatever occurred in that isolated valley was not viewed as an isolated incident, but as something with ongoing implications, something that required perpetual vigilance. For what truly terrifies is not what we can see or hear or touch, but what speaks to something within us that recognizes its call. The question that haunted Holloway throughout her investigation, the question that eventually drove her from academic life, was not what happened to the residents of Hollow Creek, but why some heard the bell while others did not. Was it, as Reverend Blackwood came to believe, a form of selection? Did the bell somehow identify certain individuals as receptive to whatever communication it transmitted? From Margaret Holloway's final journal entry, found among her personal effects after her death, I now understand why the investigation was abandoned, the record sealed. It wasn't to protect the public from knowledge of what happened at Hollow Creek. It was to protect something else entirely, to quarantine not a place, but an idea. For some thoughts, once entertained, cannot be unthought. Some bells once heard continue to ring. The most unsettling aspect of Holloway's conclusion is its implication that the phenomenon was not confined to Hollow Creek, that the bell's removal did not end whatever influence it exerted. She suggests instead that the authorities who suppressed the case did so out of fear that knowledge itself might serve as a vector, allowing whatever affected the hearers to spread beyond geographical boundaries. In the decades following the Hollow Creek incident, psychiatric literature contained scattered references to what several researchers termed auditory contagion, cases where delusions involving specific sounds appeared to transfer between patients with no apparent means of communication. These cases were predominantly reported in rural areas of Arkansas, Missouri, and Tennessee between 1910 and 1945. In each documented instance, the pattern followed a similar progression. An initial patient reported hearing bells or chimes at irregular intervals. Over time, other patients in proximity began reporting identical auditory experiences. Eventually, those affected demonstrated coordinated behaviors without verbal communication, particularly turning toward specific compass directions at identical times. These cases received little attention in mainstream psychiatric literature and were generally attributed to suggestibility or institutional contagion. What distinguishes them from typical cases of shared delusion, however, is the specificity of the experiences and their persistence even after affected individuals were separated. The last documented case occurred in 1945 at a veterans hospital in Mountain Home, Arkansas. Following complaints from several patients about bells ringing in the walls, hospital administrators relocated the affected individuals to separate facilities throughout the state. According to medical records, the experiences continued despite the separation, with patients reportedly responding to the unheard sounds at precisely the same times, despite being housed in facilities over 100 miles apart. The site where Hollow Creek Church once stood remains unmarked on official maps, but according to those few who claim to have found it, no birds sing there, even in spring. And on certain still nights, when the moon is dark and the wind moves through the valleys just so, something resonates in the hollow silence, not quite sound, but its shadow, not quite meaning, but its echo, something waiting still to be heard. In 1967, the year of Holloway's death, an unusual incident occurred at the University of Arkansas archives, where her research materials had been stored. According to reports filed with campus security, a night custodian in the archive building reported hearing what he described as a bell ringing from inside the storage room at approximately 3:17 a.m. When security personnel investigated, they found the room undisturbed, but noted that several boxes of Holloway's materials appeared to have been moved, though nothing was missing. The university subsequently transferred Holloway's research materials to a secure storage facility off campus. The transfer documentation indicates the materials were to be sealed for 50 years, until 2017. Inquiries made after that date reveal no record of the materials' location or whether they were ever released from restriction. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that the Hollow Creek incident represents not an isolated case of mass delusion, but a glimpse into something that has always existed at the threshold of human perception, something that occasionally finds ways to cross that threshold through mediums like the church bell. The anthropological record contains numerous examples of objects believed to serve as conduits between worlds: drums, bells, certain stones with natural resonance. Across cultures separated by vast distances, similar taboos emerged around these objects, specific times they should not be used, rituals required before and after their use, prohibitions against certain individuals interacting with them. What if these prohibitions evolved not from superstition but experience? What if our ancestors encountered phenomena similar to what occurred at Hollow Creek and incorporated their understanding into cultural practices designed to prevent recurrence? The bell that hung briefly in Hollow Creek Church may have been exceptional only in the degree of its effect, not in the nature of its function. Perhaps what makes the case so disturbing is not its uniqueness, but its implication that the boundary between ordinary reality and whatever affected the hearers is thinner than we like to believe, that what happened there could happen anywhere, given the right conditions and the right medium. In this interpretation, the authorities who suppressed the case acted not out of ignorance, but understanding, recognition that some knowledge is itself a form of contagion, that awareness of certain possibilities can transform perception in ways that cannot be reversed. The final mystery of Hollow Creek may not be what happened to those who disappeared, but what happened to those who didn't, those who investigated, those who documented, those who decided that some bells should never be rung again and that some stories should never be told. For in the silence they imposed lies, the most unsettling implication of all, that what occurred in that isolated valley was not concluded but merely contained, not ended but merely waiting, like a bell poised at the moment before it tolls, ready to send its vibrations through whoever might be listening. The descendants of Hollow Creek's deaf residents have scattered throughout the region, many changing their names to escape association with the settlement. Those few who acknowledge their connection to the place speak of it as a cautionary tale, though the specific nature of the caution has been lost to time, reduced to vague warnings about listening too closely or answering calls that weren't meant for you. What remains is a silence, a deliberate, constructed silence maintained across generations. And in that silence, like the pause after a bell has rung, something continues to wait for those with ears to hear.